In the grand but oppressive Hawthorne estate, Grace Tucker, a devoted housekeeper, has spent nearly a decade blending into the background of a world defined by wealth and control. But her quiet existence takes a dramatic turn when she discovers the heartbreaking truth about Rachel Hawthorne, the youngest daughter of the powerful but ruthless patriarch, Richard Hawthorne. Rachel is trapped in her father's relentless grip, facing a forced marriage designed to shield his illegal dealings. Desperate to reclaim her life, she turns to Grace, and together they uncover a trove of incriminating secrets hidden behind the estate's polished facade. With the help of Peter, the estate's gardener who has his own reasons to defy Richard, the trio forms a fragile alliance to expose the corruption that has ensnared them all. As Grace confronts her own fears and navigates the treacherous web of power dynamics within the household, she must also protect Rachel from her father's wrath and her conniving brother, Marcus, who is determined to uphold the family's dominance at any cost. In a daring bid for justice, Grace and Rachel risk everything to outmaneuver Richard, but the cost of defiance may be greater than they imagined. Will they succeed in breaking free from the shadows of the Hawthorne Empire, or will they become its next victims? The rising sun filtered through the curtains of Grace Tucker's small bedroom, spilling muted golden light over the faded floral wallpaper. She lay still for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of the Hawthorne estate waking up. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, faintly a sound at odds with the grandeur of the sprawling mansion perched on its immaculately landscaped grounds. Grace sighed and swung her legs out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. The room was sparse, a narrow bed with a well-worn quilt, a small wooden desk, and a wardrobe with paint peeling along its edges. This was her sanctuary, though its simplicity offered little comfort. A chipped mirror hung on the wall, reflecting her tired face, wisps of brown hair escaping her loose braid, faint circles under her hazel eyes. As she dressed in her gray uniform, Grace let her mind wander. It had been 8 years since she started working as a housekeeper for the Hawthorne family. She had been 26, fresh out of a difficult period in her life, when she had found the job. The estate, with its manicured lawns and towering marble columns, had seemed like a palace to her then. But the glamour had long since faded. Downstairs, the house was already stirring. Grace descended the narrow staircase that connected the servants' quarters to the rest of the house. The scent of fresh coffee and warm croissants wafted from the kitchen, mingling with the faint tang of cleaning products. "Morning, Grace," murmured Mrs. Birch, the cook, as she kneaded dough on the large marble counter. Her voice was brisk as always, but not unkind. "Good morning," Grace replied, forcing a smile. She grabbed a bucket of cleaning supplies and headed toward the east wing. Today, her tasks included polishing the silver, dusting the library, and ensuring the grand dining room gleamed in preparation for the evening's dinner party. The east wing was quiet, its high ceilings and long corridors echoing every footstep. Grace's first stop was the library, a cavernous room lined with shelves of leather-bound books that looked more decorative than read. She dusted each shelf methodically, her hands moving with practiced precision. She paused in front of the large bay window overlooking the gardens. The view was breathtaking: rose bushes in full bloom, their vibrant reds and yellows a stark contrast to the sterile opulence inside. Grace found herself lingering, imagining what it would be like to walk freely among the flowers instead of observing from a distance. "You're up early," a voice said, startling her. Grace turned sharply to find Rachel Hawthorne standing in the doorway. The youngest Hawthorne sibling, Rachel was a striking young woman in her early 20s, with a sharp wit and a reputation for defying her father's strict expectations. Her blue eyes, however, were rimmed with redness, as if she had been crying. "Good morning, Miss Rachel," Grace said cautiously, setting down her duster. Rachel's lips twitched into a faint smile. "You don't have to call me miss, you know." Grace hesitated. "It's what is expected." Rachel shrugged and stepped into the room, her bare feet silent on the plush carpet. She trailed her fingers along the spines of the books absently, her gaze distant. "You've worked here a long time, haven't you?" Rachel asked suddenly. "Yes, 8 years. Does it ever get easier?" Grace frowned, unsure how to answer. Do you mean the work? Rachel shook her head, her blonde hair catching the light. No, living here, pretending everything is perfect. The vulnerability in Rachel's voice surprised Grace. She had always seen the Hawthorns as untouchable, their lives filled with wealth and privilege. Yet here was Rachel, revealing cracks in the polished facade. It depends on what you're pretending, Grace said carefully. Rachel smiled faintly, a sad expression that didn't reach her eyes. That's the thing, isn't it? Sometimes I don't even know anymore. Before Grace could respond, Rachel straightened abruptly, her guard snapping back into place. Forget I said anything, she said briskly, brushing past Grace and disappearing down the hall. By mid-afternoon, Grace had completed most of her tasks. The dining room sparkled, the silverware arranged perfectly, and the floors polished to a mirror-like shine. Yet Rachel's words lingered in her mind. Grace often felt invisible in the Hawthorne estate, a ghost moving through the halls, tidying the lives of others while her own seemed to stand still. But Rachel's brief moment of vulnerability had struck a chord. Grace knew what it was like to wear a mask, to bury feelings beneath a surface of quiet obedience. She was lost in thought as she prepared tea for Mrs. Hawthorne in the sunroom. The matriarch of the family was a demanding woman, though less cold than her husband, Richard. As Grace carried the tray down the hallway, she passed Richard's office and heard raised voices. Pausing, she recognized Richard's deep, commanding tone. "You are being reckless, Rachel. Do you have any idea what this could cost us?" Rachel's voice, trembling but defiant, replied, "It's my life, not a business transaction." Grace hurried past, her heart pounding. She knew it wasn't her place to interfere, but the tension in Rachel's voice filled her with unease. That evening, Grace returned to her small room, exhausted. The mansion, now quiet and dark, felt like a different world from the bustling household she had tended all day. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Rachel's words echoed in her mind, living here, pretending everything is perfect. Grace sighed and glanced at the book Rachel had handed her earlier, a small, worn volume of poetry. Inside the front cover was a note in Rachel's elegant handwriting. To someone who understands what it's like to see the world from the shadows. The gesture was small, but it filled Grace with unexpected warmth. It had been years since anyone had shown her such kindness. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen not as a faceless servant, but as a person with thoughts and feelings of her own. Clutching the book to her chest, Grace made a quiet promise to herself. She didn't know how yet, but she would repay Rachel's kindness. Outside, the moonlight bathed the mansion in a pale glow, illuminating the shadows that seemed to whisper secrets. Grace didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The next morning, Grace woke before dawn, as usual. Her small room was still cloaked in shadows, the faint smell of lavender from a sachet tucked under her pillow the only comfort in the austere space. Stretching her stiff limbs, she tried to shake off the heaviness that clung to her from the previous day. Rachel's words still lingered unbidden in Grace's mind. Living here, pretending everything is perfect. She wondered if Rachel had always felt this way, or if something had changed recently. As Grace slipped into her uniform, her fingers brushed against the book Rachel had given her, resting on her nightstand. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to feel the warmth of that small gesture again. But the day's work awaited, and she couldn't linger. The mansion was quiet as Grace descended the back staircase to the kitchen. The only sounds were the faint creak of the steps beneath her feet and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the main hall. Mrs. Birch was already at the stove, her apron dusted with flour, muttering about a missing delivery of fresh cream. "Morning, Grace," she said without looking up. "Good morning, Mrs. Birch." Grace grabbed her bucket of cleaning supplies, her mind already running through the day's tasks. "Before you start," Mrs. Birch added, glancing at Grace with a rare flicker of sympathy, "Mr. Hawthorne's office is off limits today. He's having one of his meetings. Best steer clear of that wing." Grace nodded, though the mention of the office sent a ripple of unease through her. She had never felt comfortable around Richard Hawthorne, with his cold eyes and commanding presence. The way he carried himself made it clear that people were tools to him. No more, no less. By mid-morning, the mansion was beginning to stir to life. Grace moved quietly through the west wing, polishing the ornate wood banisters and dusting the corners of the high ceilings. Her mind wandered as she worked, replaying snippets of conversations she had overheard during her years in the Hawthorne household. Most were mundane, but some hinted at darker undercurrents. Hushed voices, cryptic instructions, and the occasional argument that ended abruptly when staff drew near. Grace's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps behind her. She turned to see Rachel walking briskly down the hall, her face pale and drawn. "Miss Rachel," Grace called softly, but Rachel didn't stop. Grace hesitated, her heart tugging. Then, with an uncharacteristic boldness, she followed. Rachel led her to the east garden, where she slipped through a side gate and onto a narrow path lined with towering hedges. Grace lingered in the shadows, unsure if she should continue, but something in Rachel's demeanor kept her moving. The path ended at a small, unused greenhouse tucked away behind the estate's sprawling grounds. Through the smudged glass panes, Grace could see Rachel speaking to a man. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat, and held a leather satchel. Their conversation was muffled, but Rachel's anxious gestures spoke volumes. Grace crouched behind a row of overgrown shrubs, her pulse quickening. She strained to catch fragments of their conversation. Running out of time, Rachel's voice wavered. "He won't stop until I agree." The man shook his head, his voice low but firm. "You need to leave. The longer you stay, the more control he has." Rachel turned away, pressing her hands to her face. "I can't just leave. He'll ruin me." Grace felt a pang of guilt for eavesdropping, but couldn't bring herself to leave. Rachel's words confirmed what Grace had suspected. Something far more sinister was happening within the Hawthorne household. The man placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder. "I'll do what I can, but you need to be ready. This won't end well if he finds out." Rachel returned to the house an hour later, her shoulders slumped as if she carried the weight of the world. Grace avoided her for the rest of the day, unsure of how to approach her. That night, however, as Grace folded linens in the laundry room, Rachel appeared in the doorway. "I know you followed me," Rachel said, her tone sharp but her expression conflicted. Grace's hands froze mid-fold. I was worried," she admitted. Rachel's gaze softened slightly. "Worried?" "Yes," Grace said, lowering the sheet into the basket. "You've seemed troubled lately. I didn't mean to intrude, but I couldn't just ignore it." Rachel stepped inside, leaning against the doorframe. For a moment, she looked as if she might brush off Grace's concern, but then she sighed. "It's my father," she said, her voice low. "He's trying to force me into a marriage with one of his business associates. Someone twice my age. It's all to cover up some financial mess he's created." Grace's chest tightened. She had always known Richard was ruthless, but to sacrifice his own daughter for his gain? It was unconscionable. "Can't you refuse?" Grace asked hesitantly. Rachel gave a bitter laugh. "You don't know my father. Refusing isn't an option." Grace hesitated, then stepped closer. "Maybe there's a way out. If you need help, I'm here." Rachel studied her, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Why would you help me? You don't owe me anything." Grace smiled faintly. "Because someone once helped me when I thought I had no way out. And because no one deserves to live like a prisoner, no matter how gilded the cage." Rachel's lip trembled, but she nodded. "Thank you, Grace," she whispered. Later that night, as Grace lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into dangerous territory. Helping Rachel meant going against Richard Hawthorne, a man with more power than she could comprehend. But as she thought about Rachel's haunted eyes and trembling voice, Grace knew she couldn't turn back now. For the first time in years, she felt a stirring of purpose, a determination to make a difference, no matter the cost. In the darkness, she reached for the small book Rachel had given her, running her fingers over the worn cover. The words inside had once given her solace in her own time of need. Now, she hoped they might guide her in the fight ahead. The tension in the Hawthorne estate seemed to thicken over the following days, pressing down on Grace like the heavy curtains that hung in the dining room. She moved through her chores as usual, polishing the brass sconces in the entry hall and folding napkins for another of Richard Hawthorne's formal dinners. Yet her mind was elsewhere, occupied with Rachel's confession and the quiet alliance they had begun to form. Every time Grace caught sight of Rachel, the young woman seemed more withdrawn, her usually vibrant blue eyes dulled with worry. Grace wanted to help, but wasn't sure how. Richard loomed like a shadow over the household, and every servant knew better than to cross him. Late one night, Grace lay awake in her small room, her thoughts restless. The mansion was eerily quiet, the usual faint hum of life replaced by an unsettling stillness. She sat up, the quilt pooling around her legs, and reached for the book Rachel had given her. As she flipped through its pages, a sound drifted up from the corridor outside, light footsteps, soft and hurried. Grace froze, listening intently. The footsteps passed her door, fading toward the east wing. Curiosity and concern propelled her from bed. She slipped on her robe and opened the door, just in time to see Rachel disappearing down the hall, her blonde hair catching the faint moonlight streaming through the tall windows. "Rachel," Grace called softly. Rachel didn't respond, moving quickly and quietly as if she were trying to avoid detection. Grace hesitated only a moment before following. Rachel led her to a rarely used staircase at the back of the mansion. Grace followed at a distance, her footsteps careful to avoid creaking floorboards. The staircase ended at a door leading outside, and Rachel slipped through without looking back. Grace pushed the door open just enough to peer out. The moon cast a pale glow over the estate grounds, illuminating Rachel's figure as she hurried toward the greenhouse. Grace's heart quickened as she watched Rachel disappear inside. What was she doing out here so late? Gathering her courage, Grace stepped outside. The cold night air bit at her exposed skin, and she pulled her robe tighter around her as she crossed the dew-damp lawn. She stopped a few feet from the greenhouse, unsure whether to enter or retreat. Then she heard voices. The man Grace had seen before was inside, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim glow of a lantern. His tone was urgent, though his words were muffled by the thick glass panes. Grace crept closer, the crunch of gravel under her slippers seeming unbearably loud in the stillness. She crouched beneath one of the windows, her heart pounding, and strained to hear. "I told you, Rachel, this can't wait any longer," the man said. His voice was low and firm. "You think I don't know that?" Rachel shot back, her words tinged with desperation. Grace inched closer, pressing her back against the cool glass. "If he finds out what you've been doing, it won't just be your freedom at stake," the man continued. "He'll destroy anyone connected to you. That includes me, and it includes you." "I'm not ready," Rachel whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't do this alone." "You're not alone," the man replied, his tone softening. "But you have to decide. You can't keep pretending everything will work out on its own." Rachel didn't respond, and Grace heard the sound of pacing. Grace's mind raced. What was Rachel caught up in? The man's warning made it clear this was more than just her father's controlling ways. Whatever it was, it sounded dangerous. After a moment, Rachel spoke again, her voice trembling. "I'll think about it, but I need more time." "You don't have much," the man replied grimly. Footsteps moved toward the greenhouse door. Grace ducked behind a nearby bush, her breath catching in her throat. The man stepped out, his face shadowed under the brim of his hat. He glanced around the grounds before striding off toward the service road, disappearing into the darkness. Grace waited until the greenhouse door creaked open again, revealing Rachel standing in the doorway. Her shoulders were slumped, and she looked as though she might collapse under the weight of her own thoughts. "Rachel," Grace said softly, stepping out of the shadows. Rachel jumped, her hand flying to her chest. "Grace, what are you doing here?" "I was worried about you," Grace admitted. "I heard you leaving the house, and I had to make sure you were safe." Rachel's expression hardened. "You shouldn't have followed me." "I'm sorry," Grace said quickly, "but I couldn't just ignore it. If something is wrong, you can tell me. I want to help." Rachel turned away, staring at the lantern still glowing inside the greenhouse. For a long moment, Grace thought she wouldn't respond. But then Rachel let out a shaky sigh. "Grace, you don't understand what you're asking. If my father finds out I've involved anyone else, he won't just come after me. She turned back, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. He'll come after you too. Grace felt a pang of fear, but didn't waver. I know the risks, but Rachel, you shouldn't have to face this alone. Rachel studied her for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to trust her. Finally, she nodded. All right, Rachel said. But if you're going to help me, you need to know the truth. Back in Grace's small room, Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, wringing her hands as she spoke. She explained how her father had been using her as a pawn in his business dealings, arranging a marriage to a man who could help cover up his financial schemes. But there was more. Rachel had uncovered evidence that Richard Hawthorne was involved in fraudulent activities far beyond what she'd initially suspected. I've been meeting with someone who can help me expose him, Rachel said. But it's dangerous. My father has eyes everywhere. If he finds out, she trailed off, her expression bleak. Grace listened in silence, the gravity of Rachel's situation sinking in. She had always known Richard was ruthless, but this using his daughter to protect his empire was beyond cruel. What do you need me to do? Grace asked. Rachel looked at her, surprise flickering in her eyes. You're serious? Grace nodded. I told you, I want to help, whatever it takes. Rachel hesitated, then gave a small, grateful smile. Thank you, Grace. I don't know what I'd do without you. That night, as Rachel slipped back to her room, Grace lay awake once more. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts swirling. For years, she had felt powerless in the shadow of the Hawthorne estate, her life dictated by the needs and whims of others. But now, for the first time, she felt a spark of purpose. Rachel needed her, and though the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, Grace knew she couldn't turn away. In the stillness of the night, she whispered a quiet promise to herself. I'll see this through. For Rachel. For us both. The morning after Rachel's late-night confession, Grace woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The sun filtered through the small, frosted window of her room, illuminating the neatly folded uniform at the foot of her bed. For once, she didn't linger in the warmth of her quilt. There was too much to do. As she fastened the buttons of her gray dress, Grace's thoughts turned to Rachel. The young woman had seemed lighter as she left Grace's room the previous night, as though unburdened by finally sharing her secret. But Grace knew that momentary relief wouldn't last. The challenges ahead would test them both in ways neither had anticipated. By mid-morning, Grace was scrubbing the marble floor of the grand foyer when the sound of heavy boots echoed from the hallway. She looked up to see Marcus Hawthorne, the eldest son of the family, entering the house. Marcus was everything his father admired. Sharp, ambitious, and as cold as the estate's unlit fireplaces in winter. His tailored suit and polished shoes reflected the wealth he had grown accustomed to, but his piercing gray eyes betrayed a calculating nature that often left others uneasy. Morning, he said curtly, nodding in her direction as he walked past. Grace kept her head down, murmuring a polite response. Marcus wasn't known for engaging with the staff, and she preferred it that way. But just as he reached the staircase, Marcus paused. He turned back, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Grace. Has Rachel been acting strange lately? He asked abruptly. Grace's heart skipped a beat. She straightened, careful to keep her expression neutral. I wouldn't know, sir. I only see Miss Rachel when I'm tending to the house. Marcus studied her for a moment longer, his gaze sharp. He turned and continued up the stairs, leaving Grace with the uneasy feeling that he didn't entirely believe her. Later that day, Grace found Rachel in the greenhouse, pacing between rows of potted plants. The air inside was warm and humid, a stark contrast to the crisp autumn chill outside. Rachel's hands were clenched at her sides, her movements agitated. Marcus is back, Grace said quietly, stepping inside. Rachel stopped mid-step and turned, her face pale. Did he say anything? He asked if you'd been acting strange, Grace admitted. I told him I didn't know. Rachel exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. He's suspicious. Of course he is. He's always looking for a way to prove himself to father. Grace frowned. What do you mean? Rachel sank onto a wooden bench, her shoulders slumping. Marcus has always wanted to be father's favorite. He's desperate to show he's just as ruthless and capable. If he finds out what we're doing, she trailed off, her expression grim. Grace sat beside her, resting a comforting hand on Rachel's arm. We'll be careful, she said firmly. But we can't stop now. You said it yourself, this is your only way out. Rachel nodded, though her lips trembled. You're right, but I can't shake the feeling that something's going to go wrong. That afternoon, Grace was dusting the library when Marcus appeared again. He stood in the doorway, watching her with a look of calculated curiosity. Grace, he said, his voice smooth but laced with an undertone that set her on edge. She turned, clutching the dust cloth tightly in her hand. Yes, sir. You've worked here for a long time, haven't you? 8 years, she replied cautiously. Loyal service, he mused, stepping into the room. His gaze swept over the polished shelves and the leather-bound books that lined them. You must know this house better than anyone. Grace's grip on the cloth tightened. I suppose so. Marcus smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Good. Then you'll tell me if you notice anything unusual. For example, if Rachel starts sneaking around at night, or if you overhear conversations that might be of interest to Father. Grace felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. She forced herself to meet his gaze, keeping her voice steady. Of course, sir. I'll let you know. Marcus nodded, seemingly satisfied, and left the room. As soon as he was gone, Grace sank into the nearest chair, her legs trembling. Marcus was circling like a hawk, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he found something to use against them. That evening, Grace found Rachel in her room, pacing once again. The lamp on the nightstand cast a soft glow over the plush pink carpet and the silk bedspread. We have to act fast, Grace said, closing the door behind her. Marcus is asking questions, and he won't stop until he finds answers. Rachel's eyes widened. What do you suggest? Grace hesitated, then took a deep breath. You contact the man you've been meeting. Can he help us get proof of what your father's doing? Something concrete that we can use to protect you. Rachel chewed her bottom lip, considering. He said my father keeps records of everything. Contracts, financial transactions, even blackmail material. If we could get our hands on that. Where does he keep it? Grace asked. Rachel hesitated, then said his office. There's a safe hidden behind one of the bookcases. I've seen him open it once. Grace's stomach turned. Richard's office was strictly off limits to the staff, and being caught in there would mean immediate dismissal or worse. It's risky, Rachel continued, as if reading Grace's thoughts. But if we could get in there while he's away, we'll need a distraction, Grace said, her mind already racing. Rachel nodded, her expression hardening. I can handle that. But Grace, if this goes wrong, it won't, Grace said firmly, though her heart hammered at the thought. As the night stretched on, the two women whispered plans by the dim light of the bedside lamp. They mapped out every detail, from Rachel luring her father away to Grace sneaking into the office. By the time they finished, the first rays of dawn were creeping over the horizon. Grace returned to her room, exhaustion tugging at her limbs. She lay awake for a long time, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. Marcus's words echoed in her mind, mingling with the memory of Rachel's trembling voice. This has to work, Grace whispered to herself. It's her only chance. The day of the plan arrived with a quiet unease that settled over the Hawthorne estate. Grace moved through her usual chores, her nerves tightly coiled. The household seemed unaware of the tension simmering just beneath the surface. But to Grace, every sound felt amplified: the clink of silverware, the rustle of drapes, the faint echo of footsteps in the halls. In the kitchen, Mrs. Birch was instructing a junior staff member on the intricacies of the evening's dinner service. Grace, polishing a set of glasses, caught snippets of their conversation. Mr. Hawthorne's expecting a few business associates tonight, Mrs. Birch said, her tone brisk. Make sure everything is perfect. Grace's heart skipped a beat. Richard's preoccupation with his guests might give her and Rachel the opening they needed. By late afternoon, the pieces of their plan were falling into place. Rachel would create a diversion, luring her father into the gardens under the guise of needing his advice on some inconsequential matter. Grace's job was far more dangerous. She would use the opportunity to sneak into Richard's office and search for the hidden safe. Grace waited in the pantry, her hands trembling as she watched the clock. Each tick felt like an eternity. She couldn't shake the image of Marcus's piercing gaze or Richard's cold smile. A soft knock at the pantry door startled her. Rachel peeked inside, her expression tense. "It's time," she said quietly. Grace nodded, her throat too dry to respond. The office was in the East Wing, a part of the house that always seemed shrouded in shadows, even during the day. Grace's footsteps were muffled by the plush carpet as she approached the heavy oak door. She glanced over her shoulder, ensuring the corridor was empty, then turned the knob and slipped inside. The room smelled of polished wood and leather, mixed with the faint scent of Richard's cologne. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, interspersed with framed photographs and awards. The massive mahogany desk in the center of the room was meticulously organized, every pen and paper in its place. Grace closed the door softly behind her and took a steadying breath. She didn't have much time. The first task was locating the hidden safe. Rachel had told her it was behind a bookcase on the far wall. Grace ran her fingers along the spines of the books, searching for anything out of place. After a few tense moments, her hand brushed against a faint seam in the wood. She pushed gently, and the section of the bookcase slid aside with a soft click, revealing a steel safe embedded in the wall. Grace's heart pounded. The safe had a keypad, its smooth surface gleaming under the dim light of the desk lamp. Rachel had warned her this might happen. "If the safe is locked, there's a small drawer in the desk where he keeps a list of his passcodes," she had said. "He's arrogant enough to think no one would dare look there." Grace crossed to the desk, her fingers trembling as she tried the top drawer. Locked. She rifled through the other drawers, her breath catching when she found a small brass key in one of them. It fit perfectly in the top drawer's lock. Inside, she found a leather-bound notebook. Flipping through its pages, she came across a list of codes, each labeled with a short description. One of them read "office safe." Returning to the safe, Grace entered the code with shaking fingers. The mechanism clicked, and the door swung open, revealing a stack of folders and an external hard drive. Grace didn't dare linger. She grabbed the contents, tucking them into the pocket of her apron, and slid the bookcase back into place. As she turned to leave, the sound of voices echoed from the hallway. Grace's heart leapt into her throat. She ducked behind the desk, her breathing shallow. The door opened, and she heard Marcus's familiar voice. "I told you Rachel's hiding something." Richard's deep, measured tone followed. "That's enough, Marcus. If she is, I'll handle it. You focus on tonight's meeting." The door clicked shut again, their footsteps receding. Grace waited, her pulse pounding, until the hallway was silent once more. She rose on shaky legs and slipped out of the office, her movements swift and silent. In the safety of her small room, Grace emptied the contents of her apron onto the bed. The folders contained contracts, financial statements, and emails, all detailing Richard's unethical business dealings. The hard drive, though unassuming, was labeled with a single word: accounts. She didn't know enough about finance to fully understand what she was looking at, but even to her untrained eye, it was clear these documents were damning. Rachel entered the room moments later, her face pale but triumphant. "Father's still in the gardens," she said. "Did you find it?" Grace nodded and held up the hard drive. "This is what we need." Rachel exhaled sharply, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and fear. The two women spent the rest of the evening poring over the documents, piecing together the extent of Richard's corruption. The evidence painted a chilling picture: embezzlement, blackmail, and bribes that reached into the highest echelons of society. "This is enough," Rachel said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "If we can get this to the right people, he won't be able to touch me or anyone else." Grace nodded, though her stomach churned at the thought of what might happen if they were caught. "You've been so brave," Rachel said softly, placing a hand on Grace's arm. "I couldn't have done this without you." Grace gave a small smile, though the weight of what they were doing pressed heavily on her. "We're not finished yet," she said. "We still have to figure out the next step." Rachel nodded, her jaw set with determination. That night, as Grace lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the hard drive hidden under a loose floorboard in her room. They were closer than ever to exposing Richard, but the danger felt more real than ever. Her mind lingered on Marcus's words from earlier in the day. If she's hiding something, Grace prayed he wouldn't discover what they had done. The following morning dawned gray and overcast, mirroring the heavy tension weighing on Grace. The evidence from Richard's safe was now tucked securely under a loose floorboard in her room, but the knowledge of what she and Rachel were risking made every moment feel precarious. Grace had barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the previous evening. Richard's voice echoing outside the office door, Marcus's accusations it was too close. But there was no turning back now. As she tied her apron and prepared to face another day in the mansion, Grace reminded herself of Rachel's resolute words from the night before. This is enough. We have what we need. The kitchen was bustling as Grace entered, her steps slow and deliberate. Mrs. Birch was barking orders at a junior maid, and the smell of baking bread filled the air. "You're late this morning," Mrs. Birch said without looking up from the dough she was kneading. "Apologies," Grace murmured. "I didn't sleep well." Mrs. Birch gave a curt nod, accepting the excuse, and returned to her task. Grace picked up her cleaning supplies, her thoughts already drifting to Rachel. Rachel was in the library, seated on a chaise lounge with a book open on her lap. But her eyes weren't on the pages. She was staring at the window, her expression distant. "Miss Rachel," Grace said softly, stepping into the room. Rachel startled slightly, then relaxed when she saw Grace. "Close the door," she whispered. Grace obeyed, her pulse quickening. The room was quiet save for the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. "We need to move quickly," Rachel said, her voice low but firm. "Father's been asking questions. And Marcus, he's watching me." Grace nodded. "Do you have someone in mind to take the evidence to?" "Yes," Rachel said, her hands trembling as she closed the book on her lap. "The man I've been meeting, his name is Daniel Harlow. He's an investigative journalist. If we can get this to him, he'll make sure it reaches the right people." Grace hesitated. "When would you meet him?" "Tonight," Rachel said. "He'll be waiting near the back gate." Grace's stomach tightened. "And if your father finds out?" Rachel's jaw clenched. "We can't think about that. This is our chance, Grace. We have to take it." The day passed in a blur of routine tasks, but Grace's mind was elsewhere. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corridor made her heart race. She couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was lurking, waiting for a slip-up. By the time night fell, the tension was almost unbearable. Rachel came to Grace's room shortly before midnight, her face pale but determined. "Are you ready?" Rachel asked. Grace nodded, retrieving the hard drive and documents from their hiding place. "Let's go." The mansion was eerily silent as the two women crept through its halls, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Grace's heart pounded with every step, her grip tightening on the small satchel containing the evidence. They reached the back door that led to the garden. Rachel paused, glancing back at Grace. "Stay close," she whispered. The air outside was cold and damp, the grass glistening with dew. The path to the back gate was lined with hedges that cast long, dark shadows under the moonlight. Halfway there, Rachel stopped abruptly. Grace followed her gaze and saw a figure standing near the gate. "It's him," Rachel said, relief evident in her voice. But as they moved closer, a sound behind them made Grace freeze. Footsteps. Both women turned to see Marcus emerging from the shadows, his face a mask of anger and suspicion. "What are you doing out here?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing on the satchel in Grace's hand. Rachel stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "It's none of your business, Marcus. Go back inside." Marcus crossed his arms, his gaze flicking between the two women. "You're hiding something. What's in the bag?" Grace's grip tightened on the satchel. "It's nothing, sir. Just some old papers Miss Rachel wanted to look at." Marcus snorted. "Do you think I'm stupid?" He lunged for the satchel, but Rachel stepped between them. "Don't touch her," she snapped, her voice ringing with authority. Marcus hesitated, clearly startled by Rachel's defiance. "Father will hear about this," Marcus said, his tone low and threatening. "Tell him whatever you want," Rachel shot back. "I'm done playing by his rules." The standoff was interrupted by the figure near the gate, stepping forward. "Is everything all right here?" Daniel Harlow's voice was calm, but carried an edge of warning. Marcus turned to him, his expression hardening. "And who are you?" "A friend," Daniel said simply. Rachel took the opportunity to move past Marcus, pulling Grace along with her. She handed the satchel to Daniel, her hands trembling slightly. "This is everything," Rachel said. "Make sure it gets to the right people." Daniel nodded, his expression grave. "You have my word." Marcus's face twisted with fury as he realized what was happening. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he hissed. "I've done what you never had the courage to do," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I stood up to him." Marcus took a step toward her, but Daniel raised a hand. "I think it's time for you to go back inside," he said. After a tense moment, Marcus turned and stormed back toward the house, his footsteps heavy with anger. Rachel and Grace watched as Daniel disappeared into the night, the satchel in hand. "It's done," Rachel whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Grace placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You were brave, Miss Rachel. Braver than I've ever seen." Rachel turned to her, a faint smile breaking through her fear. "I couldn't have done this without you, Grace." "Thank you." As they made their way back to the house, the weight of what they had done settled over them. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, Grace felt a spark of hope. The morning after their daring exchange with Daniel, Grace awoke to an unnatural stillness in the mansion. No voices echoed from the kitchen, no distant hum of conversation from the breakfast table. Instead, the house seemed to hold its breath, as if it sensed the upheaval brewing beneath its polished veneer. Grace dressed quickly, her nerves raw. Last night's events replayed in her mind: the confrontation with Marcus, the handoff to Daniel, and Rachel's brave defiance. They had taken a monumental risk, and now the fallout was inevitable. In the dining room, the tension was palpable. Richard Hawthorne sat at the head of the table, his usual air of authority amplified by the hard set of his jaw. His icy gaze swept over the staff as they moved about the room, but it lingered on Rachel. Grace stood by the sideboard, discreetly pouring coffee for Mrs. Hawthorne. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Rachel," Richard said, his tone deceptively calm, "I trust you had a restful night." Rachel met his gaze evenly. "As restful as could be expected, Father." A faint smirk tugged at the corner of Richard's mouth. "Good. I would hate to think anything was troubling you." Grace's grip tightened on the coffee pot, her pulse quickening. She caught Rachel's slight nod, a signal to stay steady. After breakfast, Marcus cornered Grace in the hallway. His presence was oppressive, his gray eyes sharp and probing. "What were you and Rachel doing outside last night?" he demanded. Grace kept her expression neutral. "We were walking in the garden. Miss Rachel needed some fresh air." Marcus took a step closer, his voice dropping. "Do not lie to me, Grace. I know something's going on, and I'll find out what it is." Grace held his gaze, willing herself not to flinch. "I only do what Miss Rachel asks of me, sir. Nothing more." Marcus studied her for a long moment before scoffing and turning away. Grace exhaled shakily, relief flooding her as his footsteps receded. But she knew Marcus wasn't finished. Later that day, Grace and Rachel met in the greenhouse, the one place in the estate where they felt relatively safe. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil and blooming flowers, and the sunlight streaming through the glass cast soft shadows across their faces. "Marcus knows something," Grace said, her voice low. Rachel nodded grimly. "He's always looking for a way to gain Father's favor. If he finds out about Daniel, then we need to make sure he doesn't," Grace said firmly. Rachel glanced toward the door, her expression heavy with guilt. "I hate that you're caught up in this, Grace. You've already done so much." "I chose this," Grace interrupted. "You're not forcing me into anything. I won't stand by while your father controls your life." Rachel gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you." That evening, as the mansion settled into its usual rhythms, Grace slipped into Richard's office under the guise of cleaning. She knew the risk was immense. If Marcus or Richard caught her here, the consequences would be dire. But after Marcus's confrontation earlier, she needed to confirm that their secret was still safe. The office was dimly lit, the faint glow from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. Grace moved to the bookshelf where the safe was hidden, her fingers brushing against the seam in the wood. To her relief, the safe was still locked. But as she scanned the room, her eyes fell on Richard's desk. One of the drawers was slightly ajar, a piece of paper sticking out just enough to catch her attention. Grace hesitated, her heart pounding. Every instinct told her to leave, but curiosity and fear pushed her forward. She pulled the paper free and unfolded it. It was a list of names, each accompanied by a figure politician, business partners, and staff. At the bottom of the list, her own name appeared, along with a note, "Under surveillance." Grace's blood ran cold. She tucked the paper back into the drawer and left the office as quickly as she dared. Back in her room, she paced the small space, her mind racing. Richard was watching her, and possibly Rachel. Did he know about Daniel? About the evidence? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She opened it to find Peter, the estate gardener, standing there. "Peter," she asked, surprised. Peter glanced over his shoulder before stepping inside. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by unease. "I know what's going on," he said quietly. Grace stiffened. "What do you mean?" "I've seen you and Rachel sneaking around," Peter said. "I've heard things." He hesitated, then added, "I want to help." Grace studied him, her instincts warring with her need for allies. "Why would you help us?" Peter sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because Richard Hawthorne isn't just controlling Rachel. He's been blackmailing me for years. If I don't do exactly what he says, he's threatened to deport my family." Grace's heart ached at the raw pain in his voice. "I'm sorry, Peter. I didn't know." He shook his head. "I've kept my head down for too long, Grace. If you and Rachel are standing up to him, I want to be part of it. I can't let him win." The three of them, Grace, Rachel, and Peter, met in the greenhouse later that night. Peter shared what he knew about Richard's dealings, including the frequent shipments of documents to an off-site location. "We need to act fast," Peter said. "If Richard's suspicious, he might move to cover his tracks." Rachel nodded. "We need to protect ourselves. If this falls apart, he'll destroy all of us." Grace placed a hand on Rachel's arm. "We'll figure it out. Together." As they left the greenhouse, the faint light of the moon illuminated their path. The danger was far from over, but for the first time, Grace felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't alone anymore. The air in the mansion was heavier than ever. Grace could feel it pressing on her with every step she took through the opulent halls. The knowledge that Richard was watching her, coupled with Peter's revelations about his own suffering under the Hawthorne patriarch, left her feeling like a thread stretched to its breaking point. Rachel, too, was on edge. Over the past few days, she had grown more withdrawn, her usual poise replaced by a quiet intensity. They had the evidence, but as the days passed without word from Daniel, the tension mounted. Every moment felt like borrowed time. That afternoon, Grace was cleaning the grand parlor when Marcus appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, his arms crossed, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Father would like to see you," he said, his tone almost playful. Grace's heart sank, but she nodded and set down her dusting cloth. "Of course, sir." As she followed Marcus to Richard's office, she forced herself to stay calm. The satchel was gone, delivered to Daniel, but Richard had resources she couldn't comprehend. Had he discovered their plan? Richard's office was as imposing as ever. He stood behind his desk, his piercing eyes locking onto Grace the moment she entered. Marcus lingered by the door, his presence a silent reminder of the danger she faced. "Grace," Richard said, his voice deceptively cordial. "Please sit." Grace obeyed, perching on the edge of the leather chair in front of the desk. Her hands rested in her lap, clenched to stop them from trembling. "I've been hearing some concerning things," Richard began, his tone smooth but laced with menace. "About Rachel. About you." Grace's throat tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't understand, sir." Richard's lips curled into a thin smile. "Oh, I think you do. My daughter has been distracted lately, and you've been spending quite a bit of time together." "She's been under a lot of stress," Grace said carefully. "I've only been trying to help." Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Help or meddle?" The accusation hung in the air, and Grace forced herself to meet his gaze. "I've only done my job, sir." Richard studied her for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the desk. "Let me be clear, Grace. I don't tolerate disloyalty. If I find out you've been interfering in my family's affairs, there will be consequences. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Grace said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. Richard nodded dismissively. "You may go." Back in her room, Grace slumped against the door, her hands shaking. Richard's words replayed in her mind, a chilling reminder of how precarious their position was. A knock startled her, and she opened the door to find Rachel and Peter waiting. "What happened?" Rachel asked, her voice tight with worry. Grace quickly recounted the conversation, her fear evident in every word. "He knows something," Rachel said, pacing the small room. "We have to act now, before he figures out the rest." Peter stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "There's one more thing we can do, but it's risky." Peter explained that Richard frequently transported sensitive documents to a storage facility in the city. If they could intercept one of these shipments, they might find additional evidence to solidify their case and protect themselves if Richard tried to retaliate. Rachel hesitated. "If we get caught." "We won't," Peter said firmly. "I know the route they take. We'll find a way." Grace looked between them, her mind racing. It was dangerous, but she knew they had no choice. "Let's do it," she said. That night, under the cover of darkness, the three of them slipped out of the mansion. Peter led them to a secluded spot near the service road, where one of Richard's couriers was scheduled to pass. The air was cold and still, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. Grace's heart pounded as they crouched behind a row of bushes, waiting. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, the faint rumble of an engine broke the silence. A black van appeared, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Peter stepped onto the road, waving his arms. The van slowed, the driver leaning out the window. "What's going on?" the driver asked, his tone wary. Peter motioned for Rachel and Grace to stay hidden. "There's been an issue at the estate," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne asked me to check the shipment." The driver frowned. "I wasn't told anything about that." "It was last minute," Peter said smoothly. "But if you'd rather explain that to Mr. Hawthorne yourself." The driver hesitated, then sighed and climbed out of the van. "Make it quick," he said, walking to the back of the vehicle. As soon as the driver's back was turned, Rachel and Grace sprang into action. They slipped into the van's cab, where a stack of folders sat on the passenger seat. Grace grabbed them, her hands trembling as she stuffed them into her bag. "Go!" Peter hissed, rejoining them just as the driver started to turn around. The three of them darted back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows as the driver shouted angrily behind them. They returned to the greenhouse, their breaths coming in gasps as they spread the stolen documents across the workbench. The papers were a goldmine. Financial statements, correspondence, and records of offshore accounts that painted a damning picture of Richard's corruption. "This is it," Rachel said, her voice filled with awe and fear. "This is what we need." Grace nodded, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Now we just have to get it to Daniel." Peter placed a hand on Grace's shoulder. "You were incredible back there," he said. "I don't know how you keep your nerve." Grace smiled faintly. "Because we don't have a choice." As dawn approached, the three of them parted ways, each returning to their quarters with the stolen evidence hidden safely away. Grace knew the danger wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. They were closer than ever to freeing Rachel and themselves from Richard's grasp. The next day began with an almost unnatural quiet in the Hawthorne estate. The usual hum of staff moving through the halls was muted, and Grace noticed that even Mrs. Birch seemed subdued in the kitchen. It was as if the mansion itself sensed the storm that was about to break. Grace moved through her morning routine, her mind on the stolen documents they had hidden the night before. They had agreed to meet again after dark, when the house was quiet, to finalize their next move. Until then, Grace forced herself to appear as inconspicuous as possible. Midway through the afternoon, as Grace was dusting the library shelves, Rachel found her. She looked pale but resolute, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. "We don't have much time," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel just sent a message. He wants to meet tonight. Grace's heart quickened. Did he say where? The same place as before, near the back gate. Rachel hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door. But Marcus has been watching me all day. If he sees us leave, Grace nodded grimly. We'll have to distract him. What about your father? Rachel's expression darkened. He's been locked in his office all morning. Marcus is the bigger problem right now. That evening, after the mansion had settled into its usual nighttime stillness, Grace, Rachel, and Peter gathered in the greenhouse to review their plan. Rachel and I will go to the meeting, Grace said, her voice steady despite the knot of fear in her stomach. Peter, you'll create a distraction to keep Marcus occupied. Peter nodded, his jaw set. I'll make sure he doesn't leave the house. Rachel glanced at Grace, her eyes filled with gratitude and fear. Are you sure about this? Grace reached out, squeezing Rachel's hand. We've come too far to stop now. As the clock struck midnight, Grace and Rachel slipped out of the mansion, their footsteps muffled by the damp grass. The air was cold and crisp, the faint rustling of leaves the only sound as they made their way to the back gate. Peter had done his part. From the greenhouse, they had seen Marcus storming toward the east wing, clearly enraged by whatever distraction Peter had orchestrated. For now, the path was clear. When they reached the gate, Daniel was already waiting. He stepped out of the shadows, his expression grave. Do you have it? He asked. Rachel handed over the satchel containing the stolen documents. It's all here. Everything you need to expose him. Daniel opened the bag, flipping through the papers with practiced efficiency. This is incredible, he murmured. It's more than enough. Before they could say more, a voice rang out behind them, sharp and furious. What do you think you're doing? Grace and Rachel turned to see Richard standing at the gate, flanked by Marcus. His face was a mask of cold fury, his hands clenched into fists. You've gone too far this time, Rachel, Richard said, his voice dangerously low. Do you have any idea what you've done? Rachel stepped forward, her chin high despite the tremor in her voice. I'm taking back my life, Father. I won't be your pawn anymore. Richard's eyes narrowed, and he turned his gaze to Grace. And you, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. I should have known you were behind this. Ungrateful. Insignificant. That's enough, Rachel interrupted, her voice firm. This isn't about Grace. It's about you. All of this, your lies, your schemes, it ends tonight. For a moment, the air crackled with tension. Then, without warning, Marcus lunged toward Daniel, his hand outstretched for the satchel. Grace acted instinctively, stepping between them. Stop, she shouted, her voice ringing out in the still night. Marcus hesitated, his eyes blazing with anger. This won't end well for you, Grace said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The truth is already out there. You can't stop it. Richard stepped forward, his cold gaze fixed on her. You think you've won? You think anyone will believe the word of a servant over mine? Daniel straightened, holding up the satchel. They won't have to take her word for it. These documents speak for themselves. The standoff seemed to stretch into eternity. Finally, Richard let out a low, bitter laugh. You think you're so clever, he said, his voice laced with venom. But you've underestimated me. This isn't over. We're ready for whatever comes next, Rachel said firmly, stepping closer to Grace. You don't control me anymore. Richard's gaze flicked between them, his expression unreadable. Then he turned on his heel and strode back toward the mansion, Marcus following reluctantly. As the sound of their footsteps faded, Daniel exhaled heavily. You're braver than I gave you credit for, he said, glancing at Rachel. Rachel managed a faint smile. I didn't do it alone. Grace placed a hand on her shoulder. You stood up to him. That's what matters. Back in her room, Grace sat on the edge of her bed, exhaustion washing over her. The night's events had taken their toll, but she felt a deep sense of relief. For the first time in years, the hold Richard had over Rachel and the rest of them was slipping. They had taken the first step toward freedom. As she closed her eyes, Grace allowed herself a small smile. The fight wasn't over, but together, they were stronger than Richard could ever have imagined. The morning after the confrontation with Richard, Grace awoke to a quiet house. The oppressive tension that had filled the Hawthorne estate for months seemed to have lifted, replaced by a strange stillness. She lay in bed for a moment, the events of the previous night replaying in her mind. They had done it. The evidence was in Daniel's hands. For the first time in years, the power Richard wielded so ruthlessly felt fragile. She dressed quickly, slipping into her gray uniform with practiced efficiency, but the familiar routine felt different now. There was a sense of purpose to her steps as she made her way downstairs. In the kitchen, Mrs. Birch was kneading dough, her face etched with concentration. She glanced up as Grace entered, giving her a brief nod. "You're up early," Mrs. Birch remarked, her tone neutral, but her eyes curious. Grace smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep." Mrs. Birch paused, studying her for a moment, then shrugged. "Well, there's always work to keep us busy." Grace nodded, but as she began wiping down the counters, her thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that the household was on the brink of a major shift. Later that morning, Rachel found Grace in the East Garden. The young woman looked tired but resolute, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders. "He's quiet today," Rachel said, leaning against the wrought iron bench where Grace was seated. Grace frowned. "Your father?" Rachel nodded. "I think he knows there's nothing he can do to stop what's coming. Daniel promised to publish the story within the week." Grace felt a flicker of relief, but also unease. "What about Marcus?" "He's furious," Rachel admitted. "But without father's backing, he's just noise." They sat in silence for a moment, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of fallen leaves. Finally, Rachel turned to Grace, her expression softening. "I don't think I've ever thanked you properly," Rachel said quietly. "You don't have to," Grace replied. "I just wanted to help." Rachel shook her head. "You did more than help. You gave me the courage to stand up to him. I don't think I could have done it without you." Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest. "You were brave, Rachel. I just reminded you of that." By evening, news of Richard Hawthorne's impending downfall had begun to ripple through the household. Whispers circulated among the staff, their usual hushed conversations tinged with curiosity and uncertainty. Grace overheard snippets as she moved through the mansion. "They say he's under investigation. Do you think he'll leave the estate? What about the family? What happens to them?" Grace kept her head down, focusing on her tasks, but inside, she felt the weight of the questions. She knew the Hawthorne empire would never be the same. The turning point came 2 days later, when an unfamiliar car pulled into the driveway. From her vantage point in the library, Grace watched as 2 men in suits emerged, their expressions serious. Rachel appeared beside her, following her gaze. "It's starting," she said softly. Grace glanced at her. "Are you ready?" Rachel nodded, her chin lifting slightly. "I've been ready for years." That evening, Richard summoned the household staff to the grand dining room. The air was thick with tension as they filed in, each one unsure of what was about to unfold. Richard stood at the head of the table, his once imposing presence diminished. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed, but his voice still carried an edge of authority. "As many of you have undoubtedly heard, there are allegations being made against me," he began, his tone clipped. "Let me assure you, these claims are baseless. But in light of recent events, I will be stepping away from my responsibilities here to address the situation." The staff exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and relief. After dismissing them, Richard turned to Rachel, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the room. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" he said bitterly. Rachel met his gaze without flinching. "No, I wanted freedom. This is what happens when you try to take it away." Richard's lips thinned, but he said nothing as he walked past her and out of the room. The next morning, Richard left the estate, his departure marked only by the sound of his car's engine fading into the distance. The atmosphere in the mansion shifted almost immediately. Rachel wasted no time making changes. She called a meeting with the staff, assuring them that their positions were secure and inviting open dialogue about the household's future. "We're starting fresh," she said, her voice clear and confident. "Together." For Grace, the days that followed were a whirlwind of adjustments. Rachel insisted on giving her a proper salary increase, as well as the option to leave her position if she chose. "I want you to have choices," Rachel said, "the same way you gave me mine." Grace considered the offer carefully. For years, the mansion had been both her prison and her livelihood. Now, the idea of stepping into the unknown felt both exhilarating and terrifying. In the end, Grace decided to stay at least for a while. She wanted to help Rachel rebuild, to see the Hawthorne estate become a place of kindness and fairness. One sunny afternoon, Grace stood in the garden, watching Rachel play with her young cousins, who had come to visit. The laughter that echoed across the lawn was a stark contrast to the tension that had once defined the household. Peter joined her, a small smile on his face. "You did it," he said simply. "We did it," Grace corrected. Months later, the news of Richard's arrest made headlines, the details of his corruption laid bare for the world to see. Rachel took the opportunity to publicly distance herself from her father's legacy, using the remaining family fortune to start a foundation for victims of abuse and exploitation. Grace became one of her most trusted advisors, her quiet strength and determination guiding the foundation's mission. On a crisp spring morning, Grace and Rachel stood together in the garden, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Rachel asked, her voice thoughtful. Grace smiled, her gaze on the horizon. "Every day." Rachel reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you, Grace, for everything." Grace turned to her, her smile widening. "No, thank you for reminding me that change is possible." As they stood together, the sun rising higher in the sky, Grace felt a deep sense of contentment. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. And for the first time, she was excited to see where it would lead. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more heartfelt, suspenseful, and character-driven tales, make sure to subscribe. Hit the subscribe button to join us for more gripping narratives filled with hope, courage, and transformation. Don't miss out on the next adventure. Your support keeps these stories alive.